Back, you're watching Full View. Computicket has been fined 20 million rand by the Competition Tribunal for abuse of dominance. Rival company Strictly Tickets lodged a complaint in 2008, which was followed by more complaints from at least 4 other competitors between March 2008 and September 2009. Computicket denied the charge and instead argued that customers prefer to use its services. Joining us now in the studio is Commissioner of the Competition Commission, Commissioner Thembinkosi Bonakele. Very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Let's just first start with why the case has been dragging on for a decade as it has been. What were the complications?
Well, the first defense by Computicket was to take us through all sorts of procedural objections which went to the Competition Appeal Court from time to time. So they were, for an example, wanting the case dismissed at some point, saying that we pursued them irregularly. At some point they wanted more documents from us. We were resisting that, and that went all the way through the courts.
And some of that was over ownership. I know ShopRite argued that the businesses' smaller practices, or the players, the practices smaller players, had been complicated by when Computicket was then owned by Naspers. So what did you find? Were they at least allowed to relinquish any responsibility for the current situation, or were they held accountable?
Yeah, what we eventually did was to look at Computicket and its turnover. So there was always this issue about whether we would pursue ShopRite, because ShopRite owns Computicket fully, but they bought it at some stage. So we had to link ShopRite into the case or exclude them altogether in terms of liability. So we decided to exclude them, but we have a follow-on case which we have just started. This case is for 2005 to 2010. And we have a case stemming from 2010 where now ShopRite Checkers was fully in control of Computicket.
And I want to look at those dates because it's confusing, because the investigation stretched from 1999 to 2012, but the verdict only covers the period since its acquisition by ShopRite up until 2010. Why? That's
because there were a lot of objections on the time period, with sometimes ShopRite itself refusing to be liable for this or to be part of the proceedings, and we conceded certain things, including the limited period that would be covered by the case, but they knew that there was a risk that we could always file a fresh case, which is what we've just done. So we now have a fresh case which we filed to the tribunal towards the end of last year, covering the period from 2010 up till now.
So let's look at the substance of the complaint itself. The smaller players, speaking of this monopoly, Computicket saying it's only because people preferred to use their services. So where did you find the issue was? How did it nudge out the smaller players from the competition?
Well, the real issue here is that when you have an event and you utilize Computicket to sell your tickets, they wouldn't allow anybody else from selling tickets. And there seems to be no justification for this, because you could have more than one outlet, or at least outlets owned by different people selling tickets. But clearly Computicket didn't like this. The problem is that the alternatives, which is the smaller distributors of tickets, didn't have the kind of network that Computicket had. So if you were to opt out of Computicket and use a smaller outlet, then you would not be able to distribute a ticket as widely as Computicket.
So what was the price difference? If you had a wider footprint, does that mean that Computicket were allowed to ask for more exorbitant prices for the product? What did it...
The main issue, the main harm that was caused was that the conduct of Computicket, by tying event organizers, they prevented smaller players from entering the market and providing a similar service. Of course, we would expect that in a market like that, there would be less innovation because there's a monopoly, and that prices would tend to be relatively high. So the price at which the event organizers would be charged by Computicket would be higher. That's what we understand of monopolies.
Okay, so let's talk about other monopolies. It's the beginning of the year. One of the major things that you were looking into the past 2 years was that of service providers who manipulated parents by forcing them to buy from only certain service providers when it came to school uniforms. I mean, I was looking at Twitter and some of them were calling on you to please intervene. And I'm curious, how are you implementing your findings? Because you had found against some of those monopolies.
Well, it's a fairly large and complex investigation because there are so many schools in the country. Our objection there is for schools to identify particular suppliers and not allow parents to source uniform from any other supplier except those identified by the schools. And part of that is how the uniform itself is prescribed. So if you are less generic, so you are very prescriptive on the kind of uniform, you're likely to be captured by the supplier that can produce that kind. So one of the things we've done was to guide schools on how they go about prescribing uniform and how they should go about encouraging parents to procure uniform. So part of that is compliance, self-compliance by the schools. Then there is a case that we are pursuing against the large suppliers of school uniform and some of the bigger schools. Okay. So the private schooling groups, for example, are some of those that we want to prosecute.
Thank you very much for your time. Commissioner of the Competition Commission, that is Thembinkosi Bonakele. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to take a look at your sports